It's the patron pick today, and this time, they chose to go closer to the beginning of the Pokedex by selecting Pidgeot. Pidgeot was the first in line in the Pokemon tradition of an early gen normal flying type, and this evolution line has become a fan favorite thanks to easy access. And I'm sure all of us who watched season 1 remember Ash's Pidgeotto, who was caught as a Pidgeotto and then eventually evolved into Pidgeot, which he let go like he does to all of his good Pokemon. Anyways, in later days, Game Freak made no attempts to hide their favoritism by giving popular Pokemon Mega Evolutions, and Pidgeot was one of them. And of course, it's also infamous for its rechristening as Bird Jesus from Twitch Plays Pokemon. However, we want to find out how good Pidgeot was on the competitive side. So, how good was Pidgeot actually? And in this video, we'll be covering these competitive formats. In its debut generation, Pidgeot unfortunately never appears. Its unimpressive stats leave it unable to go toe-to-toe with just about every big gun of the generation, including Tauros, Snorlax, Chansey, Starmie, Alakazam, Lapras, and God forbid there's a Gengar, Rhydon, or Golem. And funnily enough, its only decent damaging flying type moves are 2-turn moves in Flyer Sky Attack, so it loses to the grass type Exeggutor one-on-one as well. Not that it can even switch in the first place with its thoroughly lackluster defenses and lack of resist to anything other than Earthquake, and it loses to every user of that move anyway. Gimmicky players may try to make use of its signature mirror move to smack rock types off their own predicted Earthquakes, but it's a gimmick. If one was really inclined to use a normal flying type in overuse, Dodrio actually has a niche. It's got the same attack stat as the mighty Snorlax with a much higher critical rate, equaling that of the fairly crit-happy Zapdos, and outruns Jinx, making it a potential decent anti-lead that's hard to switch into if the opponent lacks a rock. Its stab Drill Peck absolutely mauls Exeggutor as well, and while it's not good at all defensively, and it's completely stonewalled if there is a rock, it's somewhat of a niche, as opposed to Pidgeot, who sadly has nothing. Pidgeot is a good choice for underuse, but from there began the stereotype that stretched across generations. Normal flying Pokemon are lower tier. Now on to Gold and Silver. Despite gaining Steel Wing and Hidden Power Ground for its nemesis, the Rock types, in addition to their new cousin, the Steel type, it was not nearly enough to even think about fixing Pidgeot's issues when it ran off such utterly meager stats. Cloyster, Skarmory, Legendary Electrics, Snorlax, Tyranitar, Suicune, Leftovers, Rest, and Sleep Talk were everywhere, and this was not an environment for Pidgeot to exist in any capacity. Even in underuse, it doesn't accomplish much of anything, since Dodrio is a major threat and completely outclasses it, and Pidgeot has nothing unique or noteworthy to offer. Thus, it finds itself in the rather desolate Neveruse, amongst several not fully evolved Pokemon. And there, it simply exists, and that is the most that can be said of its impact. On to Gen 3, it almost feels sadistic to continue listing how it just gets worse every generation for Pidgeot. Of course, it was never going to do anything when Permanent Sandstorm, Gengar, Salamence, Metagross, Jirachi, and Aerodactyl were introduced into an already harsh picture, and Dodrio and the new Swellow got baton passed to nail Skarmory with Magneton, and both were faster and stronger. Even in underuse, it's now got additional normal type competition with the incredible Kangaskhan, and there are new rock types like Lunatone to get in its way with ease. It's still outmatched here, and thus dropped to never used again. There, however, it was finally usable. With the new Choice Band, it finally started dishing out normal and flying fury upon the rather prone metagame, especially when backed by spikes. And as if wearing down its checks with hard hits and spikes wasn't terrifying enough, it could dispose of Magcargo or Graveler with the correct hidden power in one hit. Advanced Never Use is a rather niche metagame, but we're just glad Pidgeot finally gets to do something somewhere. Now, Gen 4 brings us back to the theater of cruelty, where Pidgeot yet again has no hope whatsoever of keeping up. Stealth Rock was yet another rusty nail in its already dilapidated coffin, but the real insult to injury desecration was the new Staraptor, sporting an attack stat eclipsing even Dodrio's by a significant amount to fully abuse the powerful new Brave Bird with, as well as one of the game's best abilities in Intimidate, and of course the absolutely crucial close combat that meant steals and rocks were victims instead of counters. Pidgeot could only sit in the shadows and endure the mockery, since the new flame and toxic orbs meant Swellow was the normal flying type of choice in Underused, and thus Pidgeot ended up in Never Used once again, where it existed decently but was terribly hindered by Probopass, Regirock, and Stealth Rock, in addition to its speed being lackluster when going up against Charizard and Manectric, among other things. Basically, Pidgeot did not offer anything anywhere in this generation, other than a pretty cool sprite in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. And if you thought Diamond and Pearl was a depraved wasteland from Pidgeot's point of view, you haven't seen anything else. Weather and its abusers, Ferrothorn, Terrakion, Latios. Geez, how many fan favorites have they shoved to the lower tiers without a second thought, until those lower tiers themselves resemble previous overuse, and thus the less powerful of these continue to fall into the deeper and deeper depths? Even the new lower than underused tier, rarely used, wasn't habitable for Pidgeot. And it's also very possible that Pidgeot has absolutely never been seen in a game of the slightest importance and never used. And it's also unlikely to have appeared at all outside the hands of inexperienced ladder players. New walls such as Alomomola and Clang coincided with old faces such as Golem and Probopass to completely stuff it. It wasn't bad when it came to facing off one-on-one against most other offensive Pokemon thanks to the relative frailty and its relatively decent speed, but it struggled to get in, and Charizard ruled the roost of this tier. Also, Braviary existed, and it was actually a tremendous pick with its substitute and bulk up set, rather than the liability Pidgeot brought. So, as sad as it is, Pidgeot continued to be useless. And on to Gen 6, while X and Y didn't give Pidgeot anything other than changed defog mechanics that could help with its crippling Stealth Rock weaknesses, this of course did not change anything until Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire finally cut it a break and gave it a Mega Evolution with tremendous base 135 special attack, as well as speed that was on par with the dangerous Tornadus Therian, who it would inevitably be compared to. However, it did have a few tricks up its sleeve. First of all, it gained Machamp's signature ability in No Guard. This meant that while every opposing Stone Edge, Hydro Pump, or what have you would hit, its deadly Hurricane would also never miss. And when one considers that Tornadus Therian would potentially be Uber if its Hurricane was 100%, this is a huge deal. This meant it threw around 30% confusion pretty consistently as well. It also possessed Workup and Refresh, which gave it an incredibly unique Stall Breaker niche alongside Roost. Hurricane being as powerful as it is, it was afforded the luxury of only needing to run it as its offense, and thus mopping the floor with defensive teams who relied on Chansey to take a special onslaught. Sometimes it even went on the offensive, using a can't-miss Heat Wave to crush steals, U-turning out of Heatran or Tyranitar that walled it, or sometimes going so far as to use Hyper Beam to utterly destroy the Rotom Wash that thought it had it walled, which would then open up a teammate that was walled by Rotom Wash, like Talonflame. Now this was called Bird Spam. It was a beautiful sight to see this forever passed upon Pokemon blitzing through the sturdiest teams Overused had to offer with zero issue whatsoever. Unfortunately, this didn't last, as taking up the Mega Slot was just too unviable, and Tornadus had quite a bag of tricks up its sleeves itself, mainly Regenerator, but also the ability to hold Assault Vest or Life Orb, and key moves such as Knock Off, Taunt, and its choice of fighting type coverage. Thus, it was able to more consistently deal with a wider variety of teams. However, it was definitely a nice change of pace that Pidgeot of all things, who was previously always outclassed, finally saw OU usage. It's almost enough to make a grown man cry, especially if that grown man had been unfortunate to run into it with a stall team. Pidgeot then proceeded to the next best thing, Underused, and despite the existence of Mega Aerodactyl, it utterly terrorized the tier that just was not at all equipped to switch into Hurricane. Outspeeding even rather quick Pokemon such as Cobalion, it would then proceed to utterly blow anything that stood in its path away before the opponent even had a chance to respond, unless they were packing Blissey or a very defensive Empoleon. Even Mega Aerodactyl didn't enjoy switching in thanks to Stealth Rock and the 30% confusion, which didn't help anyone in defending against it at all. Its strength and effectiveness was such that it was eventually banned to Borderline, where it now unfortunately rests in a state of permanent limbo. But in the 6th generation, Pidgeot finally made a significant mark. Who would have thought it'd ever be banned from any other tier than Little Cup? And while the swath of new Pokemon, in addition to the previous generation's experiences, meant it wasn't going to be experimented with overuse, and some new lower tier additions, such as Nihilego, meant it wasn't going to be completely overwhelming to the point of ban-worthiness and underuse, Mega Pidgeot is now one of the most threatening, definitive underused Pokemon. Mega Aerodactyl gives it competition and a check once again, but Pidgeot's sheer strength and speed lets it thrive, especially if Stealth Rock is kept off the field, and it can thus freely use U-turn so the Blissey, Nihilego, or Empoleon that just tried to counter it is now face to face with an Infernape that came in for free. And of course, it terrorizes frailer offensive Pokemon that aren't even that slow, just slower than Pidgeot, such as Infernape, Cobalion, and Crocodile. Mega competition is rather fierce, but Pidgeot is a definitive, powerful piece of Sun and Moon underuse, and it looks to stay that way for the unforeseeable future. And of course, you probably noticed we didn't cover VGC up until now, so we gotta do the part where we talk about why we've never seen it in VGC. Unfortunately, in VGC, regular Pidgeot has never had any sort of niche. Regular Pidgeot is weak, frail, and outclassed by the bevy of actually useful flying types that are probably better tailwind setters than it, and in the Talonflame years, of course, it didn't even stand a chance. And while No Guard Hurricane sounds cool on paper, its Mega form was completely and utterly outclassed, since a lot of players would most likely use a Mega slot on something like Mega Salamence. And thus, sadly, neither form has ever seen any kind of notable placement. And that's it. So how good was Pidgeot actually? Well, sadly, this fan favorite, when it comes to the competitive world, is one of the blandest, most forgettable Pokemon there is. In the competitive world, it is the stereotype for generic, bad, normal flying type. But luckily, when it got its Mega Evolution, it obtained a new lease on life and finally became viable, even making waves in overused, but establishing itself as a definitive underused Pokemon. After its first attempt at it found it to be so definitive, it ended up being too powerful. If such a thing can even be imagined from its humble origins. Unfortunately, it never had any semblance of a role in VGC, but then again, neither has Skarmory. While it's not exactly a superstar, Pidgeot is a great example of Mega Evolution giving a previously bad Pokemon a new lease on life. Now, if they would only give Mega Evolutions to some other fan favorites. Thanks for watching, everyone. Shoutouts to the patrons for voting for this Pokemon and for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False White Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And of course, as I always say, comment on what Pokemon you want to see next. And of course, follow my crew on these social media platforms, yada yada daze. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.